Good day. This is the first video lecture for History 365, Social and Cultural History of Warfare to 1789. Now, when we were so rudely disrupted by a massive pandemic, we really had just gotten to High Imperial Rome, and admittedly, even without the pandemic, we were running behind schedule. But I think it makes sense to devote at least a video to just a few words on the late Roman Empire, including the implosion of the Roman Empire, at least the Roman Empire in the West. So we left off in the High Roman Empire, say the empire as it stood in the 2nd century AD, and it was a remarkably stable empire. One that maintained a long series of frontiers running from Hadrian's Wall north of Britain, down the Rhine, across the Agri-Decumates, and then down the Danube River to the Black Sea. And then in some ways that riverine frontier continues with the northern Euphrates, a heavily militarized frontier that formed the boundary between Rome and the Parthian Empire. The Parthian Empire, roughly based in what's now Iraq and Iran, is the only other real state-level rival that the Roman Empire has. Although overall the Parthian Empire is probably not as strong or as centralized as the Roman Empire is. So this is, by and large, a stable system, an army of between 300 to 400,000 soldiers, roughly 30 to 33 legions with auxiliaries, basically maintains a pretty stable frontier. And while there is a good deal of violence, nonetheless, it's not entirely inappropriate that we call this the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And then after 235, this all falls apart. We enter a period that historians refer to as the 3rd century crisis, usually running between 235 AD and 284 AD. Admittedly, not a crisis necessarily in every moment, in every place of the empire, but nonetheless a pretty set of significant challenges. And it's probably not unfair to say that the Roman Empire comes pretty close to collapsing during this period. We can debate, why did Rome decline and fall? Did it decline and fall in the 5th century? But it comes darn close in the 3rd century. The reasons are really threefold. One, the Germanic peoples who live on the northern frontier begin to organize. They begin to form larger confederacies that transcend just small clans and tribes. And these new confederacies are things like, go by names such as the Alemanni, the Franks, the Saxons, and then on the Danube, the Goths, the Gutones, the good guys, is what that name basically means. Goth is closely related to the English good, single Germanic root. And these confederations are, still not necessarily completely centralized. The Romans confront, say, the Alemanni or an Alemannic army. The army is still led by sort of mini petty chieftains, but they're much more coordinated than the Germanic threat had been, say, in the 1st century AD, and have the capacity to destabilize Rome's northern frontiers much more than, say, an individual German tribe or a set of individual German raiders could have, say, 100 or 200 years before. The next big threat that the Romans face in the 3rd century is going to be from the east, namely the old Parthian dynasty collapses and is replaced by a new aggressive dynasty that we call the Sassanid Persians. We refer to this empire, it's basically the same empire, but the Parthians had been of a sort of a ethnicity that had come off of the Eurasian steppe way back in the 3rd century BC. The new dynasty, the Sassanids, they claim their descent from Persia, from Fars, from Iran itself. And this dynasty, in part because it's new, in part because it's trying to prove its legitimacy, seems to be much more aggressive and much more interested in engaging in offensive warfare against Roman holdings. So that's going to be a serious threat. So we have new tribal confederations in the north that are a more serious danger. We have this new aggressive dynasty in the east. These are still challenges that the Roman Empire could deal with if it hadn't itself been imploded into a set of brutal, often petty dynastic civil wars. The last sort of big stable dynasty is the Severan dynasty. It is killed off, quite literally, in 235. A army officer named Maximinian Thrax basically stages a military coup and proclaims himself emperor. But his legitimacy is very fragile, and essentially what we'll see is a whole slew of civil wars in which emperors basically try to prove themselves worthy of the purple simply by winning the civil war. And in some ways, these civil wars are simply a form of bloody imperial elections. But this is what truly devastates the Roman Empire. Because once you start peeling your legions, peeling your units off of the frontiers to engage in this sort of mutually assured destruction that is a civil war, then all of a sudden these Germanic confederacies are much more dangerous. The Sassanids are much more dangerous. And we see massive Gothic incursions. We see the Franks at times completely destabilizing the Rhine frontier. And we see huge Sassanid invasions that succeed in capturing Antioch, one of the most important Roman cities in the eastern Mediterranean. Now, importantly, while the Romans suffer humiliating defeats, heavy losses, they are able to claw their way back from the brink, just barely. They do this in part through a series of military reforms that makes the Roman army in some ways a much more technocratic institution. In particular, if we look at an earlier period, if we look in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the imperial Roman army is still largely commanded by senators. So the prefect, or I guess the legatus Augusti of a legion is going to be a Roman senator, and this is just a position that he's gotten because of his social prestige back in Rome. The provincial governors of the militarized province, the legati Augusti pro praetoribus, they are senators who oftentimes are sort of selected because they've shown some military capabilities, but are also selected because of their very high social station. With the extraordinary threats of the 3rd century, that goes away. The armies are now going to be commanded at every level by the secondary, was kind of technocratic elite of the Roman Empire, the equestrians. So therefore you're going to see all high military commanders and provincial governors being drawn from the equestrian order, and largely being drawn from within the army. So therefore we have high military commanders who have oftentimes started off as relatively junior officers. And in the sort of other political development, we start seeing emperors largely being drawn from the army. The rise of the soldier emperor, in part simply a product of these civil wars, that the person who can become emperor is somebody who can claim the loyalty of the army. But this means that increasingly our emperors are not going to be drawn from splendid families in Rome, say where the emperors have been drawn from during the 1st century AD, but oftentimes rather men who are from the ranks of the army, and mostly who have been born in the traditional recruiting grounds of the army in the northern Balkans. So this is actually going to change, in some ways, the sort of social composition of the officer corps, and in some ways that change in the social composition of the officer corps also has an influence on the social background of many of the emperors, who are less connected to the broader elite society of the Mediterranean, and are increasingly men who have simply been military officers for most of their lives. This has some benefits, in the sense that these are men who may have a deeper kind of again, technical expertise when it comes to handling military affairs. There's some real problems to this too, in that the soldier emperors oftentimes have trouble relating to the broader. Now in the 3rd century AD, we also start to see some significant changes to how the Roman army is organized and also in its weapons and tactics. So in terms of the organization, in the 1st and 2nd century, we largely just see big legions posted along various frontiers who are oftentimes not particularly committed to necessarily providing a perimeter defense, but are largely, in many instances, posted somewhat inland of, for want of a better word, the boundaries, and can respond as needed. So, for example, if the Germans are causing problems, the legions can mobilize across the Rhine, engage in some kind of retaliatory raid, and hopefully solve that problem for a while. Over the course of the 3rd century AD, and this seems to be at times a gradual change that nonetheless coalesces by the time we get to the turn of the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, we start to see a defense in depth. So what we see are the evolution of 2 different types of troops. We have the troops who secure the frontiers themselves, essentially act as a kind of border army. These are called the limitanei. And their job is basically to try to provide a degree of preclusive defense to prevent the Franks or the Alemanni or the Goths from necessarily coming in and raiding in the provinces. But there's a real problem with attempting to provide a perimeter defense. That is, if your military units are trying to defend everywhere, they ultimately can't necessarily defend any one point from a more concentrated attack. And so what the Romans do is they have behind the perimeter provided by the limitanei a series of mobile field armies. These are called the comitatenses. They are usually about 25,000 men strong. And their goal is, if there is a more serious threat, they can very quickly move in a concentrated fashion to deal with that threat once it's punched through the perimeter of limitanei. Now, these armies are increasingly heavy in the number of cavalry forces that they have, in part to give them greater mobility, although they still consist of a significant number of infantry. And there is actually a new type of cavalryman in the Roman army. This is the heavily armored cavalryman who has not only armor on the rider, but also armor on the horse. And there are 2 seemingly basically overlapping terms to describe this. Latin is Greek and Latin, used in both Greek and Latin. The cataphract. And there also is a term borrowed from the Persians, a klebenarius. A boiler boy describes a type of kind of brick oven that's used in Mesopotamia, presumably because he's so hot under his armor. This is somewhat the forerunner of the medieval knight, the idea of putting so much armor on both the cavalryman and the horse that he's able to ride into situations that a more lightly armored rider, or also even a lightly armored horse, might not feel confident in riding into, say, a hail of arrows or javelins or other missile weapons. So this is a new type of cavalry that is apparent probably by the 3rd century AD. We see it attested on, I think, a graffito in the Roman military base at Dura Europa. And again, this in some ways looks forward to the heavily armored cavalry that will come to predominate in the Middle Ages. In terms of infantry, there are also some shifts. So the legionary that we spent a lot of time talking about earlier in the semester with his oblong or rectangular shield, body shield, short gladius, fighting in a oftentimes loose or open order formation to give him and his comrades a degree of flexibility as they engage in offensive activity. That is replaced with actually a much more phalangeal formation definitely by the 4th century AD. The shields increasingly turn round again. They're not quite aspides. They're not the old hoplite shield. They still seem to be single grip shields, but they are round. And of course, one point of having a round shield is precisely to interlock with the shields of other people to form a close order shield wall. The swords, interestingly, get longer. Increasingly, the old gladius goes by the wayside and is replaced by a sword called a spatha, which in some ways is kind of the traditional northern Latin Celtic longsword, but much longer than the Roman gladius, kind of pushing 3 feet in length. It's actually not entirely clear how that worked within the close order formation. We actually find some that have been cut down in half. They're called semi-spatha by modern scholars. It's possible those are designed to be used in close infantry combat. But it does seem that long swords start to predominate. And actually, these spatha will eventually be the swords that will evolve into what will become the kind of medieval arming sword. There's actually a direct morphological lineage there. Nonetheless, when we see Roman infantry in combat, they're not fighting in loose, flexible, mobile maniples or cohorts. They are forming large, inflexible shield walls with interlocked shields, again, a sort of dense phalangeal-style formation, and they are waiting out the assaults of, say, the Alemanni rushing against them, and then they only counterattack when they feel that the Alemanni or other opponents are so exhausted that it's worth attacking, going in the offensive, either with infantry or cavalry. So in some ways, we actually see a kind of reemergence of the phalanx after more fluid, mobile, flexible tactics have predominated from the Middle Republic onward. So the Roman Empire claws its way back from the brink. By 284, there is a new dynasty, actually a set of emperors ruling as a college, the Tetrarchy, all military emperors led by Diocletian. Those of you who have taken my Roman Empire course know that this is in itself a complex arrangement that has its own positive and negative externalities. But suffice it to say, the Roman Empire reemerges in the 4th century as a relatively stable and still very, very militarily powerful force. Of course, we do know that there is going to be, whatever we want to call it, a decline and fall, an implosion, a transition, a transformation. There will be no emperor in the West after 476 AD. There is a 5th century crisis. The causes of this crisis are complex. One thing that I guess a big takeaway as we try to transition to the Middle Ages in the course of this video is quite simply the Romans are not necessarily overwhelmed militarily. We should not envision this being a crisis of the Romans holding the walls, the barbarians coming over the walls, the barbarians breaching the walls, barbarians flooding everywhere, and then everyone getting burned down and stabbed and raped and things of that nature. Now, there are places where Roman military units are defeated, and there are places where towns are captured by, say, Germanic forces. But there are many, many internal factors to this collapse. And in some ways, it is as much a failure of internal politics as it is succumbing to a military threat. Now, it is true that the implosion of the West in the 5th century does see a number of barbarian peoples forcibly settling within the boundaries of the Roman Empire. But usually that's not necessarily just as the result of straight-up military defeats. And there are Roman military defeats. And the most famous will come at Adrianople in 378, when a group of Goths is migrating. They've actually asked the emperor, "Can we come in and settle?" And the emperor says yes. They subsequently mistreat the Goths quite badly, and the Goths rebel. And the emperor moves to deal with them with his mobile field army. He's unfortunately has a co-emperor who happens to be his nephew, who he doesn't really like. And rather than waiting for his nephew to reinforce him, he tries to fight the Goths alone. And the Goths manage to overwhelm him, annihilate him and his army. This is actually a pretty significant military disaster. But it's notable that after this, the Goths are still starving and desperate. And while they are never defeated, they are, at least for a while, pinned up in a kind of reservation in the Balkans, where they're required to send recruits into the Roman army. So again, it's from here on out, there really aren't any major military catastrophes that, but it's rather an increasing inability of emperors, of the military apparatus to have either the political will to crush barbarian groups that enter into the empire, or to muster the requisite forces to confront these barbarian groups in the first place. And again, this is a period, this is the migration period. Many of these barbarian groups entering the empire, whether it's the Goths, the Vandals, the Visigoths, they are, in some instances, they are straight up refugees, and the big force that they're fleeing, the big kind of crisis that's taking place in Central Europe, is the Huns moving off the Eurasian steppe and into Poland and Germany. And this is like a huge, it's like the cue ball, the billiard or pool ball, creates a whole set of follow-on effects as those peoples, including a number of Gothic peoples, are subsequently displaced. And many of them seek refuge in the Roman Empire. Sometimes they're invited. Sometimes they're actually invited in the context of continued Roman civil wars, where a pretender will say, hey, I'm rebelling against the emperor, I want to make myself the emperor, and I'm going to invite these Vandals to come across, maybe in the hope that I can recruit them into my army. This does seem to happen after the Great Rhine Crossing of 406 AD, is that there is a pretender who may even be trying to facilitate their movements through Roman territory because he thinks it'll help him win his civil war. He loses. So these migrations do destabilize the Roman Empire. Barbarian peoples settle on lands that now the Roman Empire no longer has access to. But the inability to defeat them, again, it doesn't really involve straight up military defeats. It rather involves a massive failure of political will, the causes of which are complex. But this is not an example. Again, we should not envision the orcs overrunning Gondor and thinking, well, that's what the fall of the Roman Empire looks like. In some ways, it's much more dispiriting, simply as a military tributary apparatus really starts to break down through a whole host of predominantly political failures in the way that the Western Empire is organized. Indeed, one key reason for these political failures come from the fact that the Western Empire has very weak emperors, largely because there is a rather insidious tradition of child emperors, and these child emperors grow up to be relatively meek and mild and ineffective adult emperors. And this failure of leadership at the top seems to prevent a more effective response to the significant military challenges that the empire faces in the 5th century AD. Now, in the East, the Eastern Empire, and since 395, the Roman Empire has been divided between an emperor in the East and an emperor in the West. The Eastern emperors, of course, notably hold on. There are some child emperors in the eastern side of the empire, but in fact, in 476, in the same year that the Western Empire disappears, a new, more aggressive military emperor reemerges in the East, and therefore the Eastern Empire continues not only to hold out, but at times to even thrive. Indeed, the 5th and 6th and up into the 7th centuries, the most powerful state in Western Eurasia is still the Roman Empire. because the people based at Constantinople, they don't say, oh, the Western Empire fell. Guess we're the Byzantine Empire now. No, they still call themselves the Roman Empire. They still maintain basically the military system that had existed before, mobile field armies, limitanei providing perimeter defense. That defense in depth works quite well and continues to lead to the military success of the Byzantine Empire. And in fact, in the 6th century, a aggressive, determined emperor named Justinian oversees a series of expeditionary operations that recapture significant parts of the old fallen Western Empire, including North Africa and Italy, and reincorporates them into the Eastern Roman Empire. And some of these will be maintained for many decades to come. So at the end of this video, the Western Empire is gone, but we nonetheless have still a rump state, but a powerful rump state based in Constantinople, controlling a range of territories that run Italy, Sicily, North Africa, Egypt, Syria, the Holy Land, which is very important now that the Romans are Christians, and then up into the Balkans. So what we will do next week is start to look at the Arab invasions that completely reshape the Eastern Mediterranean, and we'll also start thinking about what happens in Western Europe, the parts of the Western Roman Empire that have fallen to basically barbarian kingdoms and the military systems that emerge out of that. So we'll talk about that soon.